We have more for your ears only. I'm David Alpern.
I'm Eddie Robinson with this quote from the news. We have to give them a credible and commendable way to change their votes. That was Connecticut's Democratic Senator Richard Blumenthal on quiet efforts to revise and revive gun control legislation defeated in April. Former supporters worried it would end up too weak. There was also concern that campaign funds directed by New York Mayor Michael Bloomberg against some Democrats who voted no last time could shift the Senate to a GOP majority. Now this.
We'll wait to get the approval from the state. Once we get the approval from the state, then we'll get approval from our county council that it's okay to start issuing, and we're ready to issue at that point.
Like many in California and across the country last week, Sacramento City Clerk Chief Deputy Donna Allred on KCRA-TV was waiting for word from the Supreme Court to filter down and permit the issuing of same-sex marriage licenses. But of course, it was California state action for and against the practice that was forcing the court to deal with the controversy in one of two landmark cases.
Indeed, while the justices considered that issue and Congress remained near deadlock on so many others, state governments are taking bolder action on social and economic matters, from immigration and gun control to abortion, voting rights, taxes, and other economic factors. And in many cases, not despite political partisanship, but because of it, demonstrating the power of one-party state rule, for better or worse. That's the conclusion of the annual State of the States legislative review by the Pew Charitable Trust's nonprofit, nonpartisan Stateline News Service. And for your ears only, Stateline Executive Editor Sandy Johnson joins us now. Welcome to the program.
Yes, thank you for having me.
Let's start with partisanship, which so seems to paralyze Washington. To what degree are state governments today dominated by one party or the other, legislatures and governors?
Well, we have a very different dynamic in the states than what we have in Washington. Out in the states, in 37 states to be exact, one party controls both the legislature and the governor's office. That's the most in 60 years. In 24 of those states, GOP is in charge, and in the remaining states, the Democrats have control of both the legislature and the governor's office.
The Supreme Court action on gay marriage could be narrowly confined to California or have impact nationwide, and a recent Pew poll showed that a majority of Americans believes that marriage should be decided state by state. So remind us about the divergence of state stands on this question, where Republicans rule and where Democrats do.
There are a dozen states in the District of Columbia that allow gay marriage. 3 states legalized gay marriage this year: Delaware, Rhode Island, and Minnesota. There are 36 states, though, that ban gay marriage, and many of those bans are amendments to the state constitutions, which are almost impossible to change because you need such a majority in each of the legislatures to change that.
There's a quiet push in Congress to revise and relaunch gun safety legislation that failed even after the mass murders in Colorado and Connecticut. What's happened in those states and others?
State legislatures considered almost 1,000 bills for and against gun control this year. And as you might imagine, it was the blue states that tightened gun control measures and the red states that actually loosened whatever measures they had. For instance, in South Dakota, teachers can now take guns into schools. Tennessee says it's okay to take your car or take your gun with you in the car, even if where you work doesn't allow guns. And in North Dakota, you can take your gun to church if your pastor doesn't mind.
Another Supreme Court ruling is expected on a key element of the Federal Voting Rights Act involving the requirement for Justice Department review of local voting law changes in areas of prior discrimination. Remind us of some of the changes that have been made at the grassroots.
Yeah, there's a lot going on that issue, too. In Colorado, the Democrats there, Democratic majority, has passed a bill that allows voters to register at the polls on Election Day, and they're joining Oregon with an all-mail ballot system. Even on the Republican side of the ledger, they are easing some of the voter ID requirements that Republican states passed in recent years, probably in response to a lot of Election Day problems last year. You may recall the photograph of the 90-something woman in Florida who stood in line for like 8 hours to vote.
While Congress struggles with immigration reform, some states have taken action on their own. Remind us which ones and in what directions.
You may recall that Arizona passed a law letting officers question people's immigration status and demand documentation. Alabama, Georgia, and South Carolina passed similar laws. But in like a dozen states, they are now passing laws in the other direction. 6 states have passed laws allowing illegal immigrants to drive, and 3 states have passed laws this year authorizing in-state tuition for children of illegal immigrants.
On health care, there was a big surprise last week when Arizona's GOP Governor Jan Brewer, a frequent critic of President Obama, won enough bipartisan support to expand Medicaid in the state under Obamacare. How has party domination affected that decision in other states?
There were 21 states in D.C. that accepted an expansion of Medicaid, and 23 states have refused it. Probably most notable is Texas, which has the highest percentage of uninsured people in the nation, and they turned down potentially $66 billion that the federal government was willing to send their way.
Also health-related is the continuing controversy over abortion. What do we see at the state level?
Well, remarkably, there are laws that are banning abortions at 12 weeks in Arkansas and at 6 weeks in North Dakota. Those laws obviously are direct challenges to Roe v. Wade, and you can expect those to be making their way through the courts. And just this week, the governor of Wisconsin, Scott Walker, said he would sign a law requiring women to undergo an ultrasound before they could have an abortion.
You also report an interesting trend in measures to protect against an expected increase in fraud and abuse under the expansion of Obamacare.
Yeah, the federal government is trying to make it easier for states to fight against fraud. Of course, Medicaid is a giant program. It costs almost $400 billion a year, and that makes it ripe for fraud. So the feds are putting together a national database of providers who have been kicked out of Medicare on the theory that they might move across the border and try to take advantage of Medicaid. They're also requiring states to do background checks on health care providers.
Sandy Johnson is executive editor of Stateline, the Pew Charitable Trust's nonprofit, nonpartisan state news service.
Quote from the news, "For a long time we were a disaster waiting to happen. I guess it finally caught up with us." That was Black Forest, Colorado resident Beverly Bailey, who sought refuge in a trailer park after her home was destroyed by the Colorado Springs wildfire that by the weekend had killed at least 2, routed 38,000, and destroyed 360 homes.
Next, Not Your Wagner's Ring, a jazz opera about boxing for your ears only.